Hi everyone, my name is Seb, and I'm presenting on behalf of our collaborators who couldn't be here today given the visa issues China situation. So I'm going to talk about false claims against model ownership resolution. As we all know, after being at USENIX for 3 days, machine learning models constitute business advantage and valuable intellectual IP. And usually we are associated with the cost of gathering relevant data, training, labeling, and all the necessary expertise. However, if you have an adversary who steals the model, they can avoid these model creation costs, assuming that the cost of executing the attack is significantly lower than the cost of training the model from scratch. And usually when talking about defending the models, you can try to prevent it or slow it down. We've seen a couple of presentations about prediction poisoning, adaptive misinformation, etc. Or you could try to detect it with techniques like Prada or some kind of classification. But there is a lot of work showing that actually it's infeasible to prevent extraction. All that we can do with such techniques is just slow it down to the point where the adversary cost analysis doesn't make sense anymore. So on the other hand, what we could try to do is deter the attacker by providing the use of model ownership verification, either via fingerprinting or watermarking. However, there are many promising model ownership verification schemes. All of them have some kind of caveats and vulnerabilities. I mean, a couple of SOKs, a couple of dedicated papers. So here we are. So in order to proceed, I'm going to give you a brief generalization of virtually or model ownership resolution schemes. So usually when talking about model ownership resolution, we start with some kind of claim generation. Have a model owner, potential accuser, who generates model ownership claim, and I'm going to call it a mock. It usually includes a trigger set, either watermark or a fingerprint. And for stolen versus independent models, naturally, the model is going to behave differently because they will or will not contain the trigger. Crucially, all model ownership resolution schemes require a secure timestamp on the trigger and the model and any kind of associated data. Unfortunately, in the majority of literature, this is omitted, but this is a necessary requirement for the security. Otherwise, we can create a trivial spoof and contest the ownership of the original model. However, in this work, we give the benefit of the doubt to practically all work in this space and assume that they do have a secure timestamp. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense and it's trivial. In order to verify the more, an accuser initiates the model ownership resolution against a suspect by sending the mock to the judge. The judge is sort of this abstract entity, as usual, that we assume in security space. It could be whoever we want. And they verify the timestamp. It could be you yourself as the model owner, or it could be some court. But let's leave it out for the legal parts of the system. And they try to resolve the ownership. They decide if the suspect has stolen accuser's model. So as it turns out, model ownership resolution schemes must be robust against two types of attackers. A malicious suspect that tries to evade the verification, for example, by pruning, fine-tuning, or noising, or a malicious accuser that tries to frame an independent model owner. And secure timestamping is the only defense in prior work. However, as I will tell you in a sec, it's not sufficient. Unfortunately, so far in research, we've primarily focused on malicious suspects that have stolen the model and tried to avoid the detection, largely ignoring any kind of malicious accusers. So in this work, we show that malicious accusers can make false claims against independent models. Adversary deviates from a watermark fingerprint generation procedure, but is still subject to a specified verification procedure. And long story short, for most schemes, we effectively generate transferable adversarial examples and register them as a false trigger. So our contributions, we formalize the notion of false claims, we provide the generalization, we demonstrate the effectiveness, and we discuss some potential countermeasures towards the end. So when talking about instantiations of ownership resolution, in general, we have two types, right? We have watermarking, typically either by backdooring, very common and popular, or by adversarial watermarking, when the adversary is trying to embed the watermark inside the adversary's model. On the other hand, we also have fingerprinting, for instance, model fingerprinting, like conferable adversarial examples, or dataset enrichment, which is kind of like fingerprinting, but relies on slightly different assumptions. And in the paper, we have a bunch of examples against all kinds of schemes, all kinds of watermarking schemes, all kinds of fingerprinting schemes. And in the presentation that I sent to USENIX, there is also way more examples. But right now, I'm going to give you one very popular backdooring example on how it actually works. So when we have watermarking by backdooring, when we generate a claim, we choose some out-of-distribution samples as a watermark, we assign incorrect labels, and we train the watermark alongside your normal training data. Of course, the model memorizes the watermark. And crucially, we obtain that secure timestamp on the commitment of the model and the watermark. When we do the verification, we query the suspect model. If we have high watermark accuracy, it's stolen. If it's low accuracy, not stolen. And we have to check the commitment and the timestamp. So if we are trying to induce a false claim, we can just scrap this generation procedure and instead find some out-of-distribution samples, make them into transferable adversarial examples, and register them as a false watermark. So what happens then is that all models that are registered with later timestamps, we can accuse them, assuming that our transferability property holds to a sufficient extent. So we evaluated against a bunch of schemes. We had just a couple that I'm going to show. There are way more in the paper, and against a bunch of data sets. Crucially, we also evaluated against the Amazon's recognition API using the Celeb A dataset. There is a model that they have. And there are 3 thresholds I'd like you to pay attention to. There is an independent threshold that the judge would derive. The independent threshold assumes that we derive it using models that have nothing to do with the adversary. They are simple, benign, independent models. We also have the extracted one, where the judge would derive it using extracted models, as in like model extracted models, or a mixed one, which is the most realistic because you would like to balance the false positive and the true positives. And crucially, for dataset inference, there's going to be some flipping involved, but if you're not familiar with the technique in the first place, then it doesn't really matter. So in the higher part of the table, I'm showing the threshold. So for the independent one, of course, is the lowest because we don't want to have any false positives. For the extracted one is the highest because we want to maximize the detection rate. And effectively, since it's many numbers, all need to understand that both numbers correspond to success for the mixed realistic setting, and if they are additionally underlined, it also means that our scheme succeeded in the most challenging setting, in the most challenging threshold. And the only one that kind of stands out is Dawn when you have a different architecture and a different data set. But we showed that generating the claims is trivial regardless of what you do. Different architecture, different data, same, doesn't matter. It's fairly easy. So what can we actually do to alleviate this? And not that much when you think about it. First of all, you might say, OK, verified computation. We'll try to ensure that the trigger set was generated correctly, and then have a VC proof that will show, OK, you actually obeyed the protocol. Well, this doesn't actually capture the watermark selection, because when you think about watermarking, usually the trigger set is the input into the scheme that is part of the core assumptions. That is not captured by VC. However, it is applicable to fingerprinting schemes, because we can put everything into the VC proof. Unfortunately, it's very expensive because derivations, for instance, for conferable adversarial examples include deriving a bunch of surrogate models. For those deriving a bunch of transferable adversarial examples, it's just a lot. And it has to include model training because there exists a theoretical attack in which the adversary manipulates the model before they derive the fingerprint. I'm not sure how easy it would be to realize it, but there is a theoretical constraint there. And it's also not applicable to DI for a slightly similar reason, because the adversary can manipulate the training data before engaging in the verified computation protocol. OK, we can do a little bit more. Instead, we could defer training of the independent models to the judge. So every time you want to make a claim, you go to a judge, you show them the claim. The judge trains independent models and makes sure that the claims do not trigger against it. And this is effective for all schemes. Unfortunately, very costly for the judge, although amortizable, because we have now this independent party that needs to have sufficient resources to train models whenever someone submits a claim. And there is also this kind of side channel style attack when the accuser can try to extract or evade those independent models, assuming that the cost is sufficiently low. So they need to be expensive. To be fair, kind of abstract. We could also ask the judge to generate all trigger sets for watermarking, right? We tell him, I'm going to train a model, give me a watermark, and I'm going to use that watermark. It's effective for many of the schemes, for many of the watermarking schemes. However, not applicable to Dawn, because in Dawn, the clients choose their queries as they send them to the model, and this is what we use to decide what the watermark is going to be. Also not applicable to dataset inference because it can be manipulated before the mock is generated. Also, the judge becomes the bottleneck in this case because every time anyone wants to train a model and watermark it, they will have to go to them and ask for it. And for fingerprinting schemes, the situation is a bit better because we can defer it until much later. Also, there are some things to consider about transferable adversarial examples in particular, because at the end of the day, this attack reduces the transferability of adversarial examples. If adversarial training is effective and the drop-in accuracy is satisfactory, you don't have to worry about false claims. Adversarial purification, also expensive and slow, but is a reasonable solution. So as long as adversarial examples, transferable ones exist, false claims are an open problem. And for Dawn specifically, we could rely on signing queries. Require all clients to sign their queries as they send them to the API, and then the judge verifies that all these queries are actually what they are supposed to be. There is this caveat that clients cannot collude with the model owner, because in which case they could just send malicious queries, we add them as the watermark, and that's it. So to conclude, model theft is an important concern. Model ownership resolution schemes have a varying degree of robustness. However, all current schemes are vulnerable to false claims. It's possible to accuse frame independent owners regardless of timestamping. And countermeasures, as we discussed, some may be more or less feasible, but are more costly. Thank you for your attention.